Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us in our continued study of Paul's second letter to the church at Corinth. This one, in every sense of the word, is a sequel. It's a follow-up to that first scathing letter, the letter that we believe was the one written with tears that Paul references here in 2 Corinthians. It has been an enjoyable study for me, and I believe for Jonathan so far. We find ourselves kind of halfway, close to halfway here as we move into chapter 6 tonight. My name is Ken Chapman. I'm the evangelist at the South Bumby Church of Christ in Orlando, Florida. And my co-teacher is Jonathan Caldwell, who's the evangelist at the Moody Church of Christ in Moody, Alabama. How are you tonight, Jonathan?
Doing all right. Just enjoying this study. I like the section we're going to look at tonight, and just enjoy wrestling with this, what I would classify as a very unusual letter from Paul.
Yeah, and one of the things I like about a study like this is that it teaches us the importance of studying the scriptures in their context. So many times we want to drop in what I talk about, parachuting into a verse or a chapter, and we may be lost somewhat. But if we can look at a book like this, one section really builds on another section and leads to the next section. And you need to understand this book almost in its entirety. It's very difficult to just look at one section of any epistle, but certainly we've seen that as a case in 2 Corinthians. So tonight's study brings us, as I said, to chapter 6, where we want to look at the first 13 verses of 2 Corinthians chapter 6. And Jonathan, would you start us off? I had to break this up into two kind of awkward sections, really kind of chopping it in the middle of a verse. But when you look at verse 8, you can see why we chose to do it that way. But anyway, Jonathan, would you read the first 8.5 verses for us, please?
Sure. Working together with him, then, we appeal to you not to receive the grace of God in vain. For he says, in a favorable time I listened to you, and in a day of salvation I have helped you. Behold, now is the favorable time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. We put no obstacle in anyone's way, so that no fault may be found with our ministry. But as servants of God, we commend ourselves in every way, by great endurance, in affliction, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labors, sleepless nights, hunger, by purity, knowledge, patience, kindness, the Holy Spirit, genuine love, by truthful speech, and the power of God, with the weapons of righteousness for the right hand and for the left, through honor and dishonor, through slander and praise.
Okay, Paul again. Now remember, much of the time in the book of 2 Corinthians is Paul really defending himself against the false accusations that some, we might even argue a minority at the church at Corinth, those accusations they were leveling against him. And in so doing, Paul has to, and we would put this in air quotes for Paul has to boast or brag about what he has done. And this is one of the three sections in the book of 2 Corinthians where Paul is going to have a list, and as we're going to see, an ever increasing list with specifics of what he has endured as a preacher and an apostle of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so again, 3 times in this book, he's going to list what he has gone through to preach the gospel. This is the most vague of those lists. He'll get in, remember the list where he talks about the numbers, the stripes, and the beatings. But now he begins kind of with the broad picture of what he has done. And he starts with the expression, working together with him. Now, here in the English Standard Version that we're using for our preferred version for this study, the word him is not capitalized, but in many of our translations it is, meaning that it refers back to God, working together with him. And this is a reference back to the last verse of the previous chapter, where of Paul, and speaking of the other inspired writers and apostles, he says, we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us. So there's the sense in which he was working with God. We understand Paul in no way is in stating that he and God are co-workers. He is no way equating their roles in the gospel in any way, but Paul is saying, here's how I'm working with him. God is working through me in my inspired role as an apostle of Jesus Christ. Now, what Paul seems to be emphasizing here may be, again, to that hidden audience of his protesters, his opponents there at Corinth and at other places, is that when you reject me, you're rejecting God. I'm just an ambassador for Christ. God is making his appeal. And so don't see this as something personal, that you're just rejecting Paul, the guy. You're rejecting Paul, the apostle, Paul, the ambassador, and in so doing, you're rejecting God. And again, the nudge there for those who would be inclined to listen to this message at Corinth is for them not to fall into that same trap that Paul's opponents there had.
Kind of reminds me of you don't hear it too often anymore, but the old prayer about preachers when they preach hiding behind the cross, removing our ego from this. It's not about us. I am just a mouthpiece. I'm just a conduit for this wonderful message of the wonderful work that God has done. And so kind of a reminder for us preachers that our name doesn't matter. You see the NBA players often point at the name on the back of their jerseys. Our jerseys don't have a name on the back of them unless it's Jesus Christ. And we have to keep that in mind.
Yeah, it's the phrase Paul used. He was just a vessel of clay,
right?
Earthen vessel, some translations say. And so in rejecting me, rejecting my message, you're really rejecting God. And so our appeal to you is not to receive the grace of God in vain. Again, that's what you're deciding on. It's not whether you like Paul or dislike Paul, or agree with Paul or disagree with Paul, accept or reject Paul. It's whether or not you're going to receive the grace of God in that form of salvation. And you can receive it in vain. This is one of many phrases and verses in the New Testament that just destroy the idea of once saved, always saved. Here to this church, to these he called saints, he is saying it is possible for you to lose your salvation. You've received the grace of God, but it can be in vain if now that you've started the race, you fail to finish that. And so don't listen to these detractors, these opponents of mine, because they are in reality opponents of God and of the grace of God. And then he quotes Isaiah 49 in verse 8. It says, in a favorable time, I've listened to you, and in the day of salvation, I have helped you. There, speaking to the prophetic Messiah, is that God is saying that I am helping you in this favorable time and in this day of salvation. And in a sense, Paul, as an apostle of Jesus Christ, as an ambassador of Christ, now sees himself in that same role, that God is helping him in this favorable time. God is the impetus behind his work in the day of salvation. And so now Paul kind of co-opts that verse from Isaiah and says it applies now to my ministry. Now is the favorable time. Now is the day of salvation. That is the fulfillment of that passage is happening now in the Messianic age, and now through me, the apostle of Jesus Christ, the ambassador of Jesus Christ, that passage is being fulfilled. Now is the time of salvation. Now is that favorable time, and God has listened and God is helping. We're working together with God, that verse emphasizes. And so Paul says, we, understanding that role, we put no obstacle in anyone's way. Now, is that just a statement of Paul, or is that an answer to some accusation that some of the opponents of Paul have made? It's both are possible, but he just simply says, we put no obstacle in anyone's way. Now, let's make an application to that today as preachers of the gospel, or of just a Christian who's to let our light so shine before men that they may see our good works and glorify our Father in heaven. Let's make sure that we put no obstacle in anyone's way. As Jonathan just said, the old phrase was, preachers stand behind the cross. And when we start getting in front of that cross and putting ourselves, our personalities, our needs and desires ahead of that, it can become an obstacle. And the way we live our lives, if our lives aren't in accordance with the message that we preach, that's a way in which we become an obstacle to people coming to the grace of God. And so everyone who would in any way teach or preach the gospel must make sure that they're not putting any kind of obstacle, no excuse in my life and in my preaching that would keep someone from obeying the gospel. Jonathan?
Yeah, Paul has already said in 1 Corinthians that the gospel itself is going to be difficult enough for people to accept. Foolishness to the Gentiles, a stumbling block to the Jews. So why on earth are we going to make it any more difficult? We need to lay it out. And I think this is what Paul says earlier and later in this letter, is that you got to lay it out as cleanly, as openly as possible, and just let the goodness come through. And anything we might do to cause an issue there is just abhorrent because of how good this is. Why are we going to insert ourselves into this equation to cause more trouble or more difficulty in accepting what is going to be hard for many people to hear anyway?
Absolutely. And you make a good point there that the gospel is already going to be rejected by some, but I want to make sure I'm not the reason that it's rejected. The gospel is going to offend some people, but I want to make sure that that offense is not coming from me, it's coming from the message. And so I deliver that message in a loving, caring, and compassionate way. Not this idea that I'm telling you you're going to hell and I seem to be enjoying it. If the gospel is going to offend, it will be the gospel that offends, hopefully not me. And Paul continues that when he says, so that no fault may be found with our ministry. But as servants of God, again, that's how he's working together with him. As servants of God, we commend ourselves in every way, everything. Now, we could make a list, couldn't we, of every way, my moral life, my style of preaching, everything that we could list there. We should be the way in which we commend ourselves so that the gospel is what's in the forefront. And if something is to be rejected, it's going to be because they rejected the gospel of God, not me as its messenger. And so now he's going to list some of those ways in which he has commended himself by great endurance. And as we read through these, I'm going to read through them rather slowly because I want you to think about Paul and how these specifically apply to the life of Paul. By great endurance, in afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labors, sleepless nights, and hunger. Well, that's Paul's right there. You could draw a line from every one of those words and write a Bible verse from the book of Acts or from one of the other epistles of Paul, or maybe multiple ones. And again, later with greater specificity, he's going to talk about some of these things, isn't he? And he says, here's how we've commended ourselves. It is by the endurance. This is my resume, is the things that I have endured in order to preach the gospel. Now, a couple thoughts come to my mind. And number one is kind of a little bit of an embarrassment. Jonathan, if you and I were making our list today, what would our list would be a little different than Paul's, wouldn't it? Paul says beatings, imprisonments, riots, labors, hunger, calamities, hardships, afflictions. I think about the hardships of me preaching the gospel. I have to wear a tie that might be on the list there. What are the hardships? Sometimes my PowerPoint doesn't work right, on a Sunday morning. Sometimes the guy is up in the sound booth, have the sound messed up. And those are my list of hardships and afflictions that I've had to endure in the preaching of the gospel. I don't think I'll bring those things up in heaven to the Apostle Paul of what I've gone through. So there's a little bit of an embarrassment there that what I complain about, and I'm being somewhat facetious there, but you think about the hardest thing I've had to face as a preacher of the gospel in the 21st century, it wouldn't even make Paul's list. Paul would say that was my good day. Your worst day was my best day. And so I think it puts things in perspective when today a preacher of the gospel complains about his lot in life and his hardships. We need to see two things. Number one is that is meaningless in comparison to what Paul and these others went through, but also that we can accept those things that we may view as hardships as Paul did, as a blessing, as a commendation of his work in the preaching of the gospel. But then he goes on to say, by purity, knowledge, patience, kindness, the Holy Spirit, genuine love, by truthful speech, and the power of God. And so here are the other things that he has on his resume. They're not all bad. The first list were things external that were happening to him. The second list seems to be more internal, of things that he possessed in his work of preaching of the gospel. And he goes on, he concludes the list by saying, with the weapons of righteousness for the right hand and for the left. Now, later in the book, in chapter 10 and in verse 4, and we'll try to remember and reference back to this in a couple other verses when we get to chapter 10. But in 2 Corinthians 10, verse 4, he says, the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. And sometimes when we read that verse, the weapons of our warfare are not flesh, are not of this earth, we think, well, that meant swords and arrows, or today, guns and tanks. And obviously that's true. That's not the weapons of our warfare. But I don't think that's the point Paul is making. That point is so obvious. The weapons of our warfare are not carnal, Paul would point out. That is, that we're not going to use means of manipulation, earthly means to entice people into the grace of God. We're going to use the tools, the weapons that God has given us, the weapons of righteousness, and that is, I preach Jesus Christ and him crucified. That's our weapons. Anything else, the weapons of unrighteousness, might be those things that would be an obstacle into someone's way of accepting and believing the gospel. Through honor and dishonor, through slander and praise. And so Paul had received some honor. Paul had received some dishonor. Paul had received some slander and some praise. Now, is that true in the general sense? Absolutely. But it's also probably true in the city of Corinth alone. That some there honored the work of Paul. Some were obviously dishonoring it. Some were praising the work of Paul, working together with God as an ambassador of Christ. But some were slandering him. And that this Paul seems to be saying that's the way it is. If you're going to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, this is going to be the reaction to it. And one of the hardest things I think Paul would have us to know is not the sleepless nights, the calamities, the beatings, and the imprisonments that were an obstacle, we're going to use his word there, to him preaching the gospel, a hardship. The greatest hardship is how he started this, and that is that some would receive the grace of God in vain. That's the part that hurt Paul more than the beatings, more than the imprisonments and the hardships that he would face. That's the greatest hardship, is that he would go through that, and then some in Corinth would either reject the gospel or would fall away from that gospel and that grace of God. Jonathan?
I'm looking at this, the second section. The first one is the physical things. in which he is commended to them. Then you have the internal things. This reference to the Holy Spirit here. Now, obviously, the ESV is capitalizing that, and I've wrestled with that. Do you think that could just be a reference to a Holy Spirit, as in your spirit, Ken, needs to be holy, or do you think that is a reference to the Holy Spirit, the being of the Godhead?
I guess it could be small h, small s. My spirit is to be holy. But I have to wonder, how would the Corinthians have known that? We see the phrase Holy Spirit, the two words coupled together, Holy Spirit. Our mind, and I would imagine the minds of the original audience, are naturally going to go to deity, to a being. And so I would have a hard time seeing it otherwise, I guess.
Well, I guess my thought is because these are characteristics of Paul. Purity, knowledge, patience, kindness. I guess you could argue, why include the word spirit there then? It would be, you might expect to read purity, knowledge, patience, kindness, holiness, genuine love. Just something I was, so then my question then is, how does the Holy Spirit fit into that list of ways that he is commending himself to these brethren? You see how purity and knowledge and patience and kindness and love work out there. Would it just be the gifts of the Holy Spirit that he is able to do, or because that would almost kick it back to physical things? I don't know. I'm just kind of wrestling with that, the role of that phrase there.
It does appear to be a little bit of a non sequitur. It doesn't kind of, the old, was it the Sesame Street song? One of these things is not like the other. I agree with that, but think of it in the sense of what he's saying. We commend ourselves by truthful speech. We commend ourselves by purity, knowledge, patience, kindness, genuine love, the power of God, and the Holy Spirit. And so these are things that commend us. Some have to do with Paul's attitudes and actions. Some, the power of God and the Holy Spirit, are the kind of the mover behind those things, we might say. That is the way I would see it. But I see your point, that it could certainly be the idea of his spirit that is motivated by the holiness of God.
Kind of the only little blip in there that caused me to wonder what's happening there.
Yeah, no, I agree. Again, through slander and praise, that's happening at Corinth. There are those opponents. We might argue again from the context of 2 Corinthians, many of those were Judaizing teachers, were seeking to slander Paul, but some were there praising him. And by the way, you make your choice, Corinthians, as to which one you're going to do. But let me remind you, I'm working together with him. I'm an ambassador of God. God is working through me. And so you decide whether you want to be on the slander side or the praise side. All right, Jonathan, will you read our last section here, verses 8 through 13?
Yes. We are treated as impostors and yet are true, as unknown and yet well known, as dying and behold, we live, as punished and yet not killed, as sorrowful yet always rejoicing, as poor yet making many rich, as having nothing yet possessing everything. We have spoken freely to you, Corinthians. Our heart is wide open. You are not restricted by us, but you are restricted in your own affections. In return, I speak as to children. Widen your hearts also.
All right. In this familiar kind of form of writing here, Paul is going to use this paradox, this seemingly contradictory terms as impostors, yet as true, unknown, yet well known. And it's really just a beautiful imagery to say that in some sense, both of these are true. We are treated as imposters. Now, he's not an imposter, but we're treated as imposters. Some, again, of Paul's opponents, that would be the first place. And if we think about it, this is a vulnerability in Paul's ministry because he would admit that he was the least of all of the apostles, that he was one born out of due season. He is kind of that addendum, that appendix, the apostle that was put on there. And so, although it was untrue, as Paul's pointing out here, that he was in any sense less of an apostle, you can see where that would be an easy target to say, well, Paul's not really one of the apostles. He wasn't one of the original 12. He wasn't one. He wasn't there in the Garden of Gethsemane. He wasn't there when Jesus walked on water and gave the Sermon on the Mount. He wasn't there when he fed the 5,000. And so you can see that would be an easy, cheap attack on the Apostle Paul. But Paul reminds them as he began his epistle, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, by the will of God. Paul is defending his apostleship. And he does that in almost every epistle where he references some kind of an attack on his ministry. He says, I'm an apostle, not a self-appointed apostle, and not even an apostle-appointed apostle. Peter didn't choose me. Jesus did. God chose me. And so he's treated as an imposter, but yet he is true. He is unknown, yet well known, dying. And behold, we live, punished and yet not killed, sorrowful, yet always rejoicing. That goes back to that list. And I would remind my preaching friends today, we can do both. We can endure whatever our hardships in preaching the gospel are and still be rejoicing. And poor, yet making many rich. Of course, obviously there's talking about physical poverty versus spiritual wealth, as having nothing yet possessing everything. That sums up the Christian life, doesn't it? And so we have spoken freely to you, O Corinthians. Now, I think the addition of that personal reference to Corinthians maybe lends to the idea that this is an answer, again, to an accusation, that Paul was holding something back. Or remember the kind of the duplicitous accusation of Paul. He's one way when he's here, he's another way in his letters. And Paul is saying, no, we've spoken freely to you. We've put no obstacle between us and the message that we're preaching to you. We've told you the message, pure and undefiled, and our heart is wide open to you. What a wonderful expression of Paul's attitude toward these Corinthian Christians, that our heart is open wide. What a beautiful way of expressing his feelings toward them and why he was going to the trouble of defending himself, defending his message, his ministry, and why he had spoken freely to you. There's a little bit of play on words, isn't there, Jonathan, in these two expressions? Can you help us to see that?
Yeah, the phrase, we have spoken freely to you, in Greek is literally our mouth is open to you. And so Paul is going to play on that concept. Not only is our mouth open to you, but our heart is open to you. And so there could be maybe an even deeper meaning here. It's not just that we're getting on to you or yelling at you or rebuking you. It's not just our words that are coming out to you, but my love, my heart is with you as well. And it's easier to take rebuke and that kind of a thing when you know where they're coming from. And so he says, our mouths are open to you, our hearts are open to you. So please take this in the manner that we mean it to some extent.
So many times my mind in Paul's relationship to the Corinthians goes to the parent-child relationship, and that certainly applies there, the discipline. And a good loving parent is going to do that. They're going to love that child so they understand that discipline's coming from a place of love, but they may actually explain it. Look, here's why I'm having to discipline you. Right. It's because I love you and I want you to be a good boy and girl. And we have those conversations. And yes, it appears Paul's having that conversation with his children here. And so he says, you're not restricted by us. Again, is that an accusation? Some language some of his opponents have used. You're not restricted by us. We've spoken openly. As Jonathan said, our heart is open and our mouth is wide open. We've spoken free. We've told you everything. We're not holding anything back. And so if you are restricted, you are restricted in your own affections. If there's a problem in this relationship, it's on your end, he's saying. I've done everything that I could. I have opened my heart. I've opened my mouth in the preaching and teaching of the gospel to you. And so there's no restrictions on my end. And maybe not just that, but Paul is just letting them know, yes, I had to be harsh in that first letter, but it came from a place of love. And so there's no hard feelings on my end. Yes, I had to get on to you. I had to chastise you and correct you, but I'm not holding a grudge. That's not because I didn't like you. It's because I love you. And so there's no restrictions here in my affections. And so Paul's plea, his beg to them is, in return, I speak as to children, widen your hearts also. You do the same. You reciprocate. You open your heart to us. And accept it. And it's kind of, we use the saying or the expression sometimes, take it in the spirit in which it's intended. Mm-hmm. Take this harsh message of 1 Corinthians in the spirit that it was intended. Yes, it was harsh. Yes, it caused sorrow, as he's going to say in the next chapter, but it was because our heart is wide open. That's why we spoke those things. And so you open your heart in reception to us, into our message as well.
Seems to have been some Corinthian pride here, kind of putting up some shields, some walls, because they had been rebuked, kind of bruised their ego a little bit. And he's saying, no, let's not do that. Understand where I'm coming from, and let's make sure this love that we do have for one another continues.
And if we're honest, we can have a little bit of that Corinthian ego when we're corrected as well. The tendency sometimes is to bow up and say, who are you? No, if I was wrong, I need to accept that correction and open my heart to that as well. All right. Thank you for joining us this Monday night for our study in 2 Corinthians. Join us next Monday night when Jonathan will lead our study beginning in chapter 6 and in verse 14. We look forward to seeing you then.